This week, we welcome to the show Sasha Ravitch. Sasha, I'm doing a new intro thing now where I describe you and you correct me or add things. So what I've got is Sasha is a transpersonal counselor, witch, and astrologer based in New Orleans with a particular specialty for ancestral curses and blessings and where they show up in the natal chart. What have I missed there?
I mean, that would be a really great, concise, and I think edifying way of describing it. I feel charmed by that. I feel good about it.
All right. So I haven't missed anything like, I've been to space or something. Nothing like...
Well, that's a whole other subject. Actually, with a lot of fear and anxiety attached to it.
Like we should start there, funnily enough, because this is before we get to the traditional first question, this is the Halloween episode. So I was thinking about titles for like the Halloween special, and we are going to talk about, for people who, which is everyone, unaware, who are listening to this or watching it, Sasha and I both spoke at Astromagia last month, whatever month it is, earlier this month, I can't remember.
Yeah.
And this is when I reached out to Sasha because she gave a fantastic presentation that I really, really liked.
Oh, thank you.
And so we're going to talk about that kind of area eventually. And I'm thinking, can we call this episode Curses from Outer Space, the Halloween special?
Yeah, I think that it has more razzle-dazzle charm factor than Blessings from Outer Space. We start to queue up a few buzzwords there that might sink us in the algorithm.
That's true. But it's definitely got the like Halloween party vibe. Curses from Outer Space. It's the Plan 9 thing. I'm into it. Because we are going to be talking about essentially haunted nativities and the stars' role in our multiple lives and the things that come down to us and all the rest of it, which is like, so we are going to have a proper magic conversation, but it is the Halloween special. So I think we can call it Talking Curses from Outer, or Halloween special, Curses from Outer Space with Sasha Ravitch. Yeah, it's pretty good. All right. Well, then on with the show and the traditional first question. Sasha, were you a weird kid?
Oh, yeah. Not in, like, the cute or endearing and charming kind of way, too. Just in, like, the, especially probably uncomfortable way. If you were to ask my parents, they would tell you it was cute and charming, and that's their job to tell you. But I somehow was really lucky to have friends. I think they overlooked a lot of the weirdness. I was, like, convinced my whole childhood that I was a fairy princess. Mm-hmm. And, like, not in the, like, child that goes through the fantasy because of, like, Disney and everything. Like, I was getting in trouble with my teachers because I was demanding to be treated better or differently because did they not know that I was royalty. So there were like it was like a behavioral problem level of delusion, which would later come to make other things more sensical or integrated in their own ways, but definitely caused a lot of concern in school. There were a lot of things that I was an only child, and I was an only child with a lot of dolls and stuffed animals.
Right.
And that tends to curate a certain breed of child weirdo that becomes adult weirdo.
Yeah,
and
especially one who thinks,
very interested
especially
in
one who thinks that she's royalty, right? Because that gives you like a court to speak to.
Yeah, I will say that adolescence really knocked me off my my self-imposed pedestal of royalty. By the time I was like 13, I did not think I was royalty anymore. So. Okay. I did get humbled by the fact that weird kids in middle school, way less permissible than, like, weird kids in elementary school, where she's like, she's got an imagination, you know. In middle school, you're just a freak.
Yeah. Fair enough. No, that's cool. All right, what else? Any other, like, so, thought you were a fairy princess, and I think that will, as you say, be relevant. One of those things that you think back on as an adult and go, I wonder if that was about that. Anything else? Like abducted by aliens, live in a haunted house, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I was obsessed with SETI as a child.
Oh, really?
Do you know SETI?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. So I made my dad download it on, this is like the old school, you know, hunk of machinery, like computer. And I would fall asleep to it every night. I was convinced that I was from somewhere else. Did not make sense to me. And a lot of that, having gone through a lot of psychological training, whether through my master's program, whether through undergrad, I come to understand that, there were other situational or environmental things that may have inculcated a predisposition toward feeling other, right? Like, it wasn't all, I'm a fairy princess. Some of it was trauma. But I was so convinced, right, that I would stay up every single night listening to the SETI live screening of the sounds in outer space, and I was convinced that I was going to hear my family come for me.
Yeah, I vaguely remember.
And I think that
was there they did that as it was almost like a promotional scam where it's help SETI sift through the data.
Yeah.
I remember that from dial-up internet days where you could use your computer.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously nothing came of it, but that's kind of clever. And I remember being so excited at the really? We can help look for aliens? That's amazing. That's cool. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, when you look back on it in retrospect, you're like, oh, that's a sad and lonely thing to do, but you're like, oh, man, ooh, hurt for that inner child. But at the time, there was a real sense of faith and optimism I had, and a real sense that even with all the ways in which reality comes and perturbs our ideals and our dreams, and reality in scare quotes or whatever, there was a real kinship I felt toward what was out there, not necessarily below the earth, and though I would later come to start making more connections between what was beneath the earth and what was up in space, and there's a lot of really rich folklore that leads into that as well. But there was a real sense of I'm more from out there. And so I think I grew up and I entered into, whether it was witchcraft or astrology, with already this idea of having relationships with the stars, or with things in the stars, or with planets, or there was an occupation of spirits within the sky, and that I felt like I was more that than I was whatever everyone was around me. And that's also a big kid and teenage mood, but the ways in which I think that remained ingrained within me really informed pretty much every decision I made in my life.
Yeah, that it is a big, certain kind of weird adolescent kid mood, right? But the other thing is, it's sort of that Skinner meme, it is the children who are wrong, because you were correct. It's just that it's the same for everyone else. They just didn't know it.
Yeah.
Right? It's
totally.
They're actually embedded in a cosmic context as well. You were the one, but you thought you were special because you were embedded in a cosmic context. Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to, because I have a question, I just make little bullet point notes before the episodes, and the next, after it says weird kid, and then it says when astrology, ? And and it's sort of, it's the right but also wrong question, because it should have been when stars, I suppose, because it's that childhood thing. Let's pick it up from there then. So did you go straight into counselor training? Did you become a counselor before an astrologer?
No. My interest in astrology also was concurrent with that middle school weird freak stage, and I remember my mom brought me a book from, I remember it was called Full Circle Books still. I think they closed many years ago. But it was the metaphysical bookshop around where I grew up. And it was a everything you need to know about fortune telling sort of style book. And there was just a very simplistic breakdown around it. And then this was right around the time where alabby.com was, I think, very popular, and I had the internet. And I became obsessed with running the birth charts of my friend when I was 13 when this happened. And it was totally teenage girl logic, right? It wasn't a profound desire to understand the ways in which these spirits occupy the mortal coil and manipulate us toward fate, as much as it was I can make people like me more if I know these things about them. I won't be on the outside if I have a way to talk to them or connect with them. It was totally manipulative, teenage girl thinking. But then I started noticing things about it, and I think the biggest goal of my life has been observing patterns and trying to aggressively assert meaning onto them in a desperate desire to sort of soothe that existential malaise. And I started noticing these patterns that became increasingly dynamic and compelling and I think, more true than the other stuff that I was recognizing. So I ended up going into counseling psychology because I specifically wanted to be a therapist for occultists because I thought we needed it really badly.
What?
And I've long had this theory, right, that no one gets into magic unless they experience like such a debilitating sense of helplessness or futility in their formative years that they decided to believe in the thing everyone tells them doesn't exist. Like, that's a real last resort. People that have it really easy, I mean, you might be naturally whimsical and enchanted, sure. But people that have it really easy aren't usually, like, trying to make the thing that they're told doesn't exist work for them. And so I was like, well, I'm watching all these people around me just attacking each other on social media or the witch wars and curses and all this stuff is all really psychological, right? And all the ramifications of it, while I absolutely, as you know, someone who talks about curses in my nativity stuff, absolutely believe in very tangible, visceral, and material histories of curse work and the way it even epigenetically affects you, I also think the worst part about that is the psychological factor. So my goal was to try and do therapy for people that were afraid to go to therapists because they thought they'd be told they were crazy for believing in spirits. Before that, I was a philosophy and English double major in undergrad, and no one thanked me for it.
Yeah.
So.
And no one ever will.
Yeah, especially continental critical theory and philosophy. Really, they still won't thank me for it. But I swear to God, I'll bring Lacan in anytime I can. So
yeah, fair enough. So from the 13-year-old who was trying to get people to like her more by, throwing some natal charts, what are the things that happens? And someone said this the other year, and I thought that's kind of correct. Typically, you only look at a few natal charts. Like, you come into astrology cold, and you only have to look at like 4 or 5 natal charts before you kind of go, there's something to this. Like, it's not just like random personality traits that anyone can. I mean, a lot of it is that too, as well, but it's not just random personality traits that people can identify themselves with. Like, you look at a natal chart or two, and by the 20th natal chart, you're like, no, there's space is real. There's something about all of this, and so if that happened to you at a young age, and then you ended up like, so you sort of found astrology first, but at some stage in the college career, you decided to essentially specialize in occultism. Is there a middle bit of like finding magic or deepening astrology? Yeah, cool. Go for that.
Well, yeah, the magic part was throughout. Like, that was the continued weird kid, right? Like, a lot of my friends or the people that knew me in high school, none of them are surprised by where I ended up and what I do. I was trying to read tarot, on the grass during lunch, and I was always reading certain books, and that was like, I was also the Harry Potter generation, so there was like a certain, I think, I got made fun of a little bit for it, but it was more useful because everyone wanted to know what that boy thought about them, right? Like, whether or not he liked them back. And so I found the utility of magic to be, and I that stuck with me. I'm a big praxis person. Like, I can romantically love theory, but I find there's a sort of masturbatory nature to the theory if I can't immediately improve my life or other people's lives with it. So that the actionable results of magic are what brought me further into it, and I fucked around in ceremonial stuff for a lot when I was younger, but ultimately always found my way back to this really more hereditary witchcraft of the Vlach people, and the Balkans and the Slavic classes of spirits and traditions therein that are truly the biggest home for me. But I when I finished my undergraduate program, and before I went into grad school, I worked in community mental health with folks with comorbid psychosis, usually meth-induced, and battling with houselessness, and they were usually taken out of the acute psychiatric services and brought back into the community restored. And the thing that made it impossible for me to, and I wanted to originally just stick with mental health related stuff and just keep, the magical interest, the spiritual interest for myself. And I just saw time and after time clients that I identified, and this was perhaps a bold or audacious identification on my behalf, as experiencing spiritual emergency. And phenomena that did not seem to me to be explicitly chemical or like having a matter of their neuropathology. It seemed like there were really weird things happening, like someone saying that thing's about to move and then it moved, and that for me started bridging this gap, and I became more interested in like, well, who helps the people that have trauma but like also have genuine relationships with spirits and needs to believe in and hold at once both realities, that those are both truths that can coexist as opposed to preclude each other.
And so that, I mean, how do you, if you're going to grad school to effectively specialize in that, is that what you say to your tutor? Like, I wish to counsel people who are obviously have mental health issues, but also spirits.
I went to the California Institute of Integral Studies.
Okay, cool.
In their integral counseling, and so there was like a little bit that was, if you were going to go to a school where you could lead with that per se, that was a good school to do it at. And I didn't really experience a lot of backlash. The reason why I ended up not feeling really fulfilled in the ways that I wished as far as the spiritual components of it is that it felt very much like white people trying to incorporate Eastern, like superficial Eastern shamanistic practice. Well, especially when we looked at this was a big like Ram Dass thing and Terence McKenna, and all of this was a really integral part of the foundation of the school. And there was a lack, I think, of the deepening of these things, and also, quite frankly, just not ultimately the compatible. I had more issues with the fact that I am very psychoanalysis heavy. That's what I'm in love with. I love Freud. I love Lacan. I don't love Jung, and that was like a big issue at this school where what I was really compelled toward and felt was much more substantiated by the ways in which I've interacted with spirit or recognized its ministrations within the psyche was sort of disavowed as like old and not humanizing enough, not gentle enough, right? And I guess you heard my talk at Astromagia. The number one feedback I got was everyone was, I loved it. I loved how harsh you are. And I was like, oh, I guess that's a compliment.
Yeah.
But that's the world that makes sense to me. That's the one I occupy. Yeah. So the school was very accepting about me being like, well, I want to do this for people that are in possessory cults. Did a whole research paper on the benefits of possession for psychic integration. And they were really supportive of that. If you could prove why, if you can show your examples, that's why. It just ultimately wasn't what I was looking for.
No. It's a really important critique, and not to, because you're talking about luminaries like McKenna and Ram Dass, but it is important, important critique that the second half of the 20th century, the kind of like Escher worldview is a thing that has shortcomings, and it is there's some unexamined or like a challenge. They're yet to examine the Orientalism in it and the niceness, and you get that. And again, even with powerful techniques like archetypal astrology, they're still they don't have the teeth, I think, a practice like that needs. So I absolutely agree, and I think that's a really good way of describing it too. There's nowhere else you could do that work, and it's not like they weren't supportive of it, but the world in which you did that isn't your world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I felt like a very sharp knife surrounded by sticks of butter. And I mean that in a very like kind way. Like I've never met as many genuinely kind, compassionate people that seek to understood. I was very supported by my peers. They're amazing, and I was just it's not where I was meant to go. It's not where I was supposed to be. And I think I'm infinitely better for it. I don't regret it at all. Yeah. But
no, but also like
done better in Vienna, 100 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. And also like sticks of butter are very useful as are knives. So that's a healing modality that a lot of people will resonate with, but is not the people you were looking to help. And I think that's borne out
Absolutely.
by the feedback from the conference going, yeah, I liked how harsh you were. And I think, that's good, right? Because that means there are people who are listening to it going like, I actually do need that bitter medicine. I need to know that, yep, that's what
Totally.
this is. And some people don't. Some people need to be softly brought to that rather than huzzah, right?
Well, yeah, and I think that part of the problem is that people forget that the invention of astrology wasn't to make you feel good about
No.
yourself, right? It was usually to help you like address very terrible things, to hopefully serve the prevention, if nothing else, an intervention. But the assessment, diagnosis, remediation, whatever of more malefic fallout experiences, obstacles, drowning at sea, whatever, being devoured by a wild beast, like we have more metaphorical ways of maybe experiencing some of these things than quite as literally these days. But I think I'm a very compassionate and empathic person. I've never really had people tell me that I'm not a tender person who's willing to hold and support and love someone through it. I just refuse to coddle or make light of. I know as like that weird kid, right? That weird kid who had to go to the school counselors and stuff. That someone sort of patronizing you about your lived experience is way worse than being like, yeah, it fucking sucks. Doesn't that suck? Like, and that's what you need in that moment. Like, yeah, that is hard. I'm not gonna tell you that if you have, a really afflicted Saturn in the 7th house that, that's not gonna be big ouch energy, but I also think that the natal chart always avails us with a resource, an answer to every question, like some sort of curative that helps soothe whatever sort of abscess we might be experiencing somewhere else. And maybe it never fully evens out or equalizes, but you can't really. I don't think it's ethical to ignore what we see as points of pain.
Yeah. So I know you don't like Jung, but one of the things he says that's, I think, germane there about natal charts and the rest of it, obviously he's referring to complexes, which is that we never heal our complexes, we just get bigger than them. And I mean, you can use different words for it, but I think when there are challenging configurations in a natal chart, you are those challenging configurations come to Earth for, again, maybe not healing, but getting bigger than. It's here to play that out, and there's no sense in sugarcoating that. Like, no, it'll be fine. It'll be, you'll live happily ever after. You'll marry young and live happily ever after. It's like, well, you won't. So
most people won't.
Yeah.
I mean, that's I think one of the reasons why, especially more traditional or Hellenistic or Mesopotamian and Babylonian astrology doesn't really. I mean, we're seeing a huge renaissance in it right now, which is very galvanizing, especially over the more kind of evolutionary or modern forms where there was always this eye toward a more beautiful future. But I think a lot of the reasons why that sort of fell out of favor is we're looking at an American population, and I'm speaking because that's the only population I've ever really known or lived in, that is told that the average baseline outcome, experience, expression of your life should be a happily ever after. That's even a totally achievable thing. Not to say that it isn't. I'm sure for some people it is. I would love to meet them. Prove me wrong. But that I think when you're reading these ancient texts, right, and even Manilius, who's writing in such a poetic way, he's also being like, all death is painful and hard. Like, all lives are painful and hard. It's more about identifying what kind of painful and hard you're probably going to be dealing with, and not creating this expectation of a life that isn't cultivating a sense of suffering, of difficulty, of obstacles. Like, you really can latch on to points of joy, to points of strength, and these ephemeral experiences of whimsy when you don't have that as a baseline, that you're told that you're failing if you can't maintain.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the medicine of these older forms of astrology, where like every star configuration, I mean, even the best, most benefic thing you could look at, it was like, and then you are betrayed by someone you love, and they stab you in your parlor while you sleep. But for the most part, you were remembered as a good and kind ruler. There's like the balance there. at least, which is for me much more realistic. I don't feel like someone's lying to me.
Yeah, exactly. That's, I think, one of the shortcomings, just coming back to that 20th century mode, is that it was so ensconced in post-war capitalism that it mistook that for reality. So this kind of, that idea, that post-war promise that things will always get better is mistaken for reality, when in fact that was only true for white people in one country for about 30 years in the history of mankind.
Some things will get sort of better for some people for some period of time in some way.
And funnily enough, that is astrological, because you can look at that and go, yeah, Kingdom's got like a good year and a half ahead of it. And that is in fact astrological, if you can see it. If you can look at it and go, yes, it would have been amazing to be a white heterosexual boomer. What a great time to be alive. Like, that's just true.
Jupiter is so well dignified in this mundane chart, you know?
I love that. I think that's, this is really good, because we need to get to the curses from outer space. But when we were kind of going backwards and forwards to arrange times and so on, you mentioned, I think there's a journey, there's a practical, as in a magically operant journey, as well as an intellectual one that got you to where, got you to the presentation at Astromagia, right? And so you sort of mentioned that there are star beings and star lineages from like Vulcan and Romani lore that sort of are part of this journey somehow?
Yeah. And I think, the interesting, and I'll say this right, the interesting thing about astrology, and one of the things I appreciate it, is there usually is some modicum of more scientific rigor, right? Like, you need to be able to show your math, show your work. And I think that is part of the reason why it, whether rightfully or not, gets respected more than certain other types of divinatory or metaphysical arts. And why historically it has garnered more respect than, say, stigma of charlatanry, right? Because you have these techniques and there's a sense of math, and because of that, I found a really big crisis for me when I started experiencing stellar spirits, and in particular certain asterisms, or even different planets in ways that, or lunar mansions, that did not feel like I could substantiate this in this particular text, this particular work. And then there is that dreaded fear of like, oh no, am I gonna like have unverified personal gnosis? Like, what will the Facebook community say about
the bed bugs of the magical world. Yeah,
as opposed to like, oh wait, how did any of this stuff originally kind of get recorded?
And also, isn't this what it's for?
Anyway. Yeah, literally, if you can't have a personal relationship with these spirits, it sort of eliminates the practical use of them, right? And I think, as someone who's always been interested in obsessed with relationships, I was actually struck by how difficult it was at first to accept that, how much of my own westernized wiring I had, even though I knew I came from a lot of people that had very specific lived experiences with stars. The Pleiades, I really loved all the depth that you went into in your Astromagia talk about in particular, but that's such a great example of an astrosome, because you literally find every single, northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere culture has some sort of conversation about that, even if it's stories that were brought back. And for the particular intersection of the Vlach people, which are the Calderas and the Vlach are my main ancestral sides on my mother's side. There's a belief that all the Roma people come from the Pleiades, because they're always running from something. They're always being pursued. They're always being hunted. And a lot of the Balkan lore, which was fascinating for me when I got to a point where I started reading about all the cross-continental kind of affinity of these stories of these women that were exiled or running or leaving. They're always being hunted by something big and strong and powerful with better weapons, right? This Orion figure that's coming after them. And in particular, they were considered these witches that wouldn't marry. And all the Vlach people come from them, right? They're witches because, one, they wouldn't marry. Two, the only way they would become pregnant would be via spirit possession / not in the Virgin Mary kind of like, oh, what a beautiful and sacred thing, but in like in tranquil spirits of the dead being carried in their womb, right? And there's a whole tradition of pain wafery is essentially what I've taken to call it, because there's no English translation for the term. But they were women that messed with fate, and they petitioned the fates so much that eventually and finally they were cast into the sky, where they would have to run up there, but they would show all of their other children essentially how to follow or proceed after them. Wherever they went, that created some of the nomadic travel cycles around following them. And in particular, there's all this lore regarding if there's shooting stars that are seen around them, that means they're coming down to Earth. Now, what's really interesting is over time, this got transformed into what were referred to as the Little Vlachs, right? So that's the name of a people. It also means dragons, right? And there was this idea of connection to the Slavic god Velis, who is for those that aren't aware, is a chthonic dragon, serpent, but also bear, both agricultural harvest god as well as oracular, prophetic, necromancing god who would lead the spirits of the dead down the river so that they would find paradise, because the Slavic underworld is not the hell as we would see it in contemporary times. It's a beautiful oasis. And this was also the home of the Pleiades. And the Pleiades also had an entryway that was reflected in a cave in the bottom of the world that was 7 pools, of which their starlight reflected in it of water. And when we had a chronicle, like the rising versus setting, they would be emerging from or delving into those pools, and that's how they would get back to the heavens. So they would come to the earth during the summer months, and they would travel, and they would show, and they would teach their lessons. And this is when the women would start getting possessed by fairies. And prophesying with fairies and scrying with fairies. These long, blonde-haired, like we get the same Pleiadian sort of spirit-related aesthetic that seems to also be across many cultures as well. But these in particular are known in the Balkans as like the Samovila. 7 sisters, usually three to 9, but often 7 sisters. And they live up in those stars. And in order to be a particular, the American or the English translation is like the one who falls, right? Pararica, or the Sojamanka, the one of the fairies. There was a direct initiation there. So this is where things kind of link back for me, right? When I start finding out a lot of this stuff, and this is my direct heritage, and that I started noticing that a lot of my work with the others led to incredibly vivid, profound, abjectly terrifying in many ways, experiences with this asterism that and I told myself I wasn't going to say this, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I'm on it, is that they were abductions in many ways. And it made me very unconvinced that abduction requires you physically being beamed up somewhere, and that this is like an interspatial experience, because the ways in which I encountered these things, I came back with bruises, right? All the lore of people that got abducted by fairies, all the lore of people that went to the Sabbath and woke up and they didn't realize where they were. All these things started experiences piled up. And it was at a real peak last summer in particular, and then even through part of the spring, to a point where the Balkan spirit, the Alkonost, who is named after Alcyone, right? The Siren Spirit, this harpy spirit, showed up, and I had an incredibly visible, or vivid dream that wasn't really a dream. And I woke up, and there was a weird feather that I'd never seen in my life in my bed.
Yeah, very cool.
And that was my moment where I was like, oh, and I'm not a believe whatever I want kind of person. I have Saturn in the first house. I'm full of doubt about everything. So I went and I got, the divination after, someone who didn't know anything, someone that would automatically say this wasn't a thing even, to try and just prove myself, because you asked the people in my life at that time, I thought I was going crazy, And it reflected some experiences I had as a 13-year-old where I also thought I was going crazy, where all of a sudden I was seeing what I would learn were actually my ancestors, but no one was going to tell me that. I just, again, thought I was going crazy. And things changed very much after that. I realized there was an initiation, and since then, it's been a real passion / obsession. to kind of learn all of the real witchcraft and spirit work associated with my countries of origin and the folk astronomy more than the astrology there, right?
Yeah. Well, that's always what's interested me. I will just point out, because it triggered something from the most recent course, 2/3 of Americans who will admit to having what is currently called an alien abduction admit that those experiences were non-physical. So literally the majority of what we should call experiences, right, rather than abductions, and in fact most people in that world do, 2/3 of them they know are non-physical but are nevertheless real. So the 2/3 are reported ones. So you think it's actually not even like an unusual case of experience, it's the norm. The unusual ones are when people get moved, as you say, or feathers show up. You're like, this is, I don't remember getting to this hill. Or in the case of some of the witch trial or the interrogations of Scottish witches in particular, like, how did I get to France? That's impressive, right? So, I just wanted to point that out there. But I'm really interested in, and my talk was kind of about how, particularly if people come to magic from astrology rather than astrology from magic, I sometimes see that things are out of sequence, where there aren't star spirits because of astrology. There is astrology because of star spirits. So the kind of system of astrology we have in the West or anywhere is a co-production between humans or people who are currently in human bodies and star beings, right? So that was kind of, people haven't listened to it. It was a great conference, and that presentation and the rest of them are at the conference website. Or I think I've got it in the members area now. Anyway, but that sequence, because there's a chaos magic thing that I think is under, although I'm playing with it this year, that I think is useful, which is find a way to make it true. Because chaos magic began with like, anything can be true, and that's not correct. That when you say anything can be true, what you're actually saying is the only true thing is that nothing is true and I'm the one saying it. So it's actually still like a colonizing voice. But if you say find a way to make it true, I was trying to work out how does Aboriginal star law and Mayan star law and Hellenistic astrology, how are they all, in what universe do they all work? In what universe are they flourishing? And it's that relational contact, which I think it's really fascinating to hear that Pleiades story in that sense, because that's a perfect example of the kind of relations that lead to astrology rather than astrology leading to those relations. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I mean, I was really, I was set, right? Like I had not only my independent study with my, my necro-astrological stuff, but I didn't need, and I told myself that I was like, the star stuff is for me. I even told my best friend, I was like, I'm not going to become a person who publicly does star stuff. Like, this is going to be my own, and then it just became impossible not to. The more, the level of visceral and almost like ineluctable need to then start to communicate the things that are coming through is really where there are a lot of different types of levels of possession and influence at any given moment, right? And we have this idea, I think a lot about how the fixed star by parents stuff that Brady did talks, I think a lot of times, like, in the mythological way, and sure, the stars, come down to the earth and they walk in certain ways, but there is such a idea of distance, of these being, like, further away, more ancient, and perhaps less contact-based than the planets, right? And I would even say that a lot of the more grimoire sort of astrological approaches sort of have a similar idea there too, where you might at least get a servitor of Jupiter who will come and show up for this thing that you're doing, blah blah blah. But I have found that the stars are there even if you're not calling them.
That's it. Yes,
and
that's very true. The first time I started doing, because it just didn't look right, there was not enough drama in it. But the first time I did like a Picatrix mansion talisman, And there's not much in the way of ceremony around it. I'm like, what? If you're using the Key of Solomon, you've got like 20 minutes of invocation before any of this stuff happens.
Totally.
But you get the timing right, and they're just there, and you go, wow, this is pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Instantaneous.
Yeah.
And I've wondered, because I'm a big, I'm a huge Saturn enthusiast, devotee, etc., right? And I find that Saturn is one of those planets that just shows up, too. I think also because he's, on some level, ready to show up for anything that isn't just Malefica. He's, like, so grateful that someone wants to be more disciplined, But as opposed to just, like...
He also is the showing upness of the universe, right? Like,
absolutely. I mean, he's he's the one who's going to close make it the temple for you by showing up.
Yeah.
He's there whether or not you want him to be.
Yeah, that's cool. Because actually, one of my questions, we should do that. Like, we've sort of spoken about star spirits, unless there's something there. But it was apparent to me watching your presentation that you, which I share, but you have an interest in the malefic, in the astrological sense, as well as the magical. But we're going to talk about the astrological now. And is that Saturn first house business, or like is it in your chart, or was it there beforehand? Did you I've told the story a few times, but not for a while. As a kid, like preschool, I was evidently too stupid to realize Skeletor was the bad guy in He-Man. And so I had all the Skeletor toys, and Mum tells this story of me sitting on the couch watching He-Man as a toddler with my Skeletor toy, and it suddenly occurred to me, because he lost again, as he always does. And that Mum says, I saw the exact moment when you realized that he was the bad guy and that he was never going to win. And you bawled for like 20 minutes. I had Skeletor backpack for preschool, all the toys. He-Man,
my God.
Which is ironic how my life turned out. He's this closet case whose best friend is a cat who sneaks out of the house in furry underwear to hang out with mustachioed men. There's like a 80s AIDS parable in here somewhere, I'm sure, because his villain is Skeletor. But Skeletor is cool and better staff and skull face and all that. So good
laugh. Yeah, great laugh.
Exactly. So the Malefics had me at hello. And I think that's one of the things I resonated with. But so for you, it was the same, like in astrology, drawn more to this is a perennial hangover, I think, from that. And again, not throwing too much shade, very 20th century astrology where people would try to make Saturn and Mars nice and try to make Venus, love is complicated. And that breaks the system. That might be right of a being, but it doesn't, it breaks the system, right? So when we say an interest in the malefics, it's not in the sense of turning them into plush toys as much as it is an interest in the role of malefics in the cosmos and people's lives, surely.
Totally. Yeah, I think it was Austin Kopic who made a joke to me, because my Saturn's in the first house in Sagittarius, and he was like, leave it, to Saturn and Sagittarius to still have a good time or get excited or enthusiastic about Saturn. And I do think that adds a certain level of support to my desire to the malefics. I mean, both malefics are really strong in my chart. And everything else is kind of in a huge disarray. So I think I may have already been of the impression that I was going to develop Stockholm Syndrome a little earlier on. And if I was going to be sort of stuck with the idea of the wounds, and Freedom Cole is this amazing thing we're always talking about. It was no matter how happy someone looks, no matter how great their life looks on social media, they still have Saturn somewhere in their chart, right?
Yeah.
And for me, that was a great equalizer, especially when I was, again, going through these experiences of the comparative effort. Why can't I do that as gracefully or easily or whatever the fuck, right, as someone else can? I think that we do ourselves a great disservice when we are treating our pain, our wounds, our ugliness as something abject that is to be ignored, right? I've used this metaphor, I think, in the panel at Astromagia about how if there's a screaming, angry, crazy man in your house, if you ignore him, that's not usually the best approach. Something's going to happen. And if you try and chase him out or pretend he's not there or kick him out and call the cops. All of those things really inflame the situation. I think regarding with certain level of honesty and compassion and empathy, the ways in which we are monstrous, the ways in which we are volatile, or the ways in which we crave annihilation, all of these things are hugely freeing for us. One of my favorite psychoanalysts is Melanie Klein, and she was known as the Empress of Hate, ironically an Aries. But she was the one who talked about, and no one in Victorian England rewarded her for this. I will say it. She's not fondly remembered as a result of it. She was the one who was talking about how children had a homicidal impulse, right? Like there was a desire to destroy. And that by telling them that couldn't be expressed, it was going to turn pathological. And I believe, not that everyone has a homicidal impulse, but I believe we all have a punitive impulse.
Sure.
And the malefics are punitive planets, right? They're effective and they work very well, and they're also where we are judge, jury, and executioner. And that's a thing we all have. We have every single planet, right? And I this is what I always try when I have clients that have really messy or powerful malefics in their chart, and really afflicted benefics. I try and remind them, like, we have all these planets. We have every single one. We don't get to pick and choose. Even though I sometimes give a lot of shit to Jupiter. So I will take accountability for the way I do that. But we don't really get to pick and choose those things. I think I've always had I don't identify as like an edgelord, but I've always, I think, loved the things that other people didn't.
Well, that's literally Saturn first house Sag, right? Because it's literally going after the bad, like delighting in the seeking of the bad, like the sort of questing energy within Saturn. So I can, that's Edward, you can say it. I find a sense of sattvic freedom
in looking at the darkness there, and I find it to be immensely liberating and immensely joyful. Not like I don't seek these dark feelings or these dark experiences as a place of like staying stuck or ruminating in them, but I think all feelings are so incredible, and that to feel anything in any capacity is a huge gift, and I'm voraciously curious about, more importantly, where those things come from and why, and the patterns therein, and what we can learn from them, and how we can engage them, and how we can sort of, obviously the goal is to not always have that pain. A lot of times that pain is for life, though. Like certain traumatic wounds, the scar tissue, right? It's still there. There's still a mark on you.
Yeah.
And I think if we can re-enchant the way we engage with pain and the way we can engage as story carriers that have had these experiences and therefore are able to perhaps have more connective and enriched relationships with others. And this was I'm definitely not the astrologer for everyone, but the clients that come to me are definitely my clients. And we get to have these really raw, incredible conversations about the way that we've been influenced by the world and the way we influence it back. And there's an honesty there. And there's a laughter there, right? I think Saturn has an incredible sense of humor.
Totally.
And I think that it's important to remember that Mars originally was an agrarian god. He was a Pan-like figure, and like the Sylvanus figure, the Sylvan figure. He was a witch father and a fairy king of his own right. And there are more Bacchanalian aspects to Mars that often, I think, are missed as well. And when we allow ourselves to revel in the mysteries of the malefics, we become appreciative of the challenges that they give us as well. I say that now, and I'm still gonna, as a day chart person, bitch about this current Mars transit.
Oh my
but
God.
Nonetheless, I know that it's teaching me something.
Yeah. No, well, because yes, I told you I have that Jupiter Saturn conjunction Libra 12. So Mars has just been, and that obviously it's opposite. I've had like a Mars transit of endless health issues, and now that it's back, in Scorpio, it's a brand new fucking day because I am exhausted. Every couple of years this happens. I like blood pressure, eye problems, all kinds of stuff. I barely want
Well,
to be on
really,
Earth with an echo.
right out of the lily, huh?
Yeah. Oh,
Blood
look.
pressure, eye problems.
Oh, it was, yeah. And it started off directly opposite my moon as well. So it was just smashing the
Oh,
12th and a whole bunch of stuff I have in there and opposite the moon and squaring basically everything else. It was whenever Mars is in Libra, I'm just going to go fishing and probably net fishing because I don't want to be around sharp objects because this has been
yeah,
like the transit from hell. So yeah,
yeah,
absolutely get that. But so I'm sort of thinking this is interesting because we need to talk about curses from space. You have the counselor's understanding of and appreciation for trauma. You have kind of like the spirit worker's understanding of star spirits and the wider implications of that, ancestral and belonging and so on. And then this kind of, I don't want to even say malefic centric, but malefic positive? That's like body positive, or like, you know what I mean?
yeah.
Version of astrology. And so then, because you gave this amazing presentation, I want you to kind of like, obviously not repeat the presentation, but talk us through this idea of using the houses as a way of understanding ancestral gifts and legacies in general, but like gifts and curses that may be operant in the native's life. Because I thought that was fantastic. That was absolutely my energy. But like, how did you come to that as a framework? Did it start showing up in like client readings and then go, oh, I'm seeing more of this, and it built out from there, or did you go hunting for that kind of understanding and then deploy it in client lives? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. It actually started. So I started noticing it. God, I think in earnest about 10 years ago. Though I was able to go and look back and see that I had picked up on certain things before. But in general, about 10 years ago, and it started with Saturn in the 4th house. Every single time I saw Saturn and my whole sign. But every time I saw Saturn in the 4th, and it's not, and I'll say really quickly, this might also apply for other house systems. I just haven't tried or done the level of research, so I won't make any claims toward that. But almost every single time I saw Saturn in the 4th house, it communicated a very specific wound around, yes, usually an absent father or a difficultly attached father or an abusive father or a dead father, etc. But more importantly, I started to be able to identify the ways in which it communicated a lineage of these patterns, in particular, usually the father's side and so on and so forth. And that's sort of where I just started. And I did it really casually, where I was like, wow, this is really weird. But then I was like, astrology is supposed to do this. Like, it's supposed to work, right? This way, where, it's not going to be the case for everyone, but a delineation is really not going to come up in a certain way if there isn't some sort of truth behind the mechanics of it. But what started freaking me out was the ways in which I noticed this begin to occur again and again. And so I had the novel idea of just like writing these things down, whether it was like the charts of my clients, whether it was charts of friends, volunteer charts, throw in and ask me anything onto Instagram to see if other people had this sort of experience, to a point where it was like nausea inducing how concrete and how enduring many of these delineations came. But I was really interested in the houses because I think that they tend to be one of the most overlooked, and maybe arguably good reasons. Can I tell you? But they're really overlooked.
Can I tell you my take on that? Because it's still speculative as to where Hellenistic astrology got house systems from, and I think that's one of the most clearly Egyptian parts of astrology, and it is a operationalized version of Ra's movement through the underworld. So when the sun, the sun does different things during. Ra is fighting jackals here. Ra is crossing a river here. As he moves, there are these tasks and beings that he encounters, and I think so. It is literally. I'm fascinated by that. I like the houses better.
Me too.
I think the houses are a map of the other world, like an Egyptian map of the other world, and that's why when you were doing this system, I'm like, this bitch has nailed it. because where else are you going to get ancestral gifts and curses but from the other world? Anyway, carry on. Sorry.
Absolutely. Well, and I say that I'm scrying the natal chart because I really do feel like I'm gazing into a skull cap, black mirror, whatever you want it to be. But I'm not like seeing the heavens when I'm looking at the natal chart. I feel like I am above looking down at the earth and the layers of the world and the earth as occupied. Like, you could make it about like the different layers of hell, right? Where people are stuck where, which planets are symbolizing which, is it the mother's side? Is it the blah, blah, blah? And the more I started doing it and the more I was like, okay, take a risk. Stop being so obsessed with someone telling you that, you're crazy or that you're not playing enough by these rules. You're already not playing by the rules by focusing so much on houses, right? And trying to do these things with houses and planet in ways that are not already accepted or talked about. But I was like, well, what happened if I just enlisted some of my spirits to help me as liaisons show me what's going on? And it became a really oracular experience at that point. And I started seeing people's dead show up, people's other than human spirits that were connected. That was one of the biggest trips about the nativity, is when I started seeing spirits that weren't ancestors show up really strongly. There was a really good example of this was seeing a golden stag show up for someone. And I was like, wow, that's weird. That's cool. This is what I'm seeing. I'm sorry, I don't know which delineation it's coming from, but I see it coming from your second. It's like in the second house, Saturn. And I'm like, well, that's my father's side coat of arms magical animal. And I was like, blah, 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 because you can have this happen over and over again, but if there's still a real shock to the body, to the spirit of having these things corroborated. And I think that sense of wonder and awe about seeing true never gets old. It's one of the things that I think is the reason why I'll never burn out in this work. And specifically this type of work. But I have struggled, and got this book that I'm working on for Rebel Lore, but I struggled to necessarily find a way to tell other people how to do it if they aren't willing to believe in spirits or that it can work. And that's the thing, right? Like, of course that sounds like a snake oil thing. You have to believe that this kind of thing can work for it to work. So I'm very cognizant of the ways in which that sounds, like the dreaded new agey kind of spiel. But if I can't make someone believe in spirits, I can't explain why Cancer Moon conjoined Mars in the 8th house is going to speak to like the Rusalki class, right? But if people are going to walk with me and they're willing to, I've seen incredible things happen. I've seen them go to their family and then learn that their great grandmother did drown, and we're able to identify that it's her in particular, and we make those offerings that are folklorically relevant to their ancestral heritage, and all of a sudden they don't have that problem anymore. They fall in love with someone who loves them in a reciprocated way, and they're engaged, Yeah, well, so I think that aliveness is the most important part of the dead in the natal chart.
I absolutely love that, and because I'm a big fan of Dr. Daniel Foer's work, and even Constellation Therapy. Anytime you engage with the ancestors from a healing perspective, it's transformative in a way. And I got this from Dr. Foer, which I think is true. He's like, he'll get his clients, he's not practicing anymore, but he would get his clients to, even if they don't believe in spirits, say the stuff out loud, and the results in their life would be greater than if they had, like, quote unquote, just done talk therapy. But coming back to you have to believe in spirits. One of the things that I think, and I noticed because I came from Magic to astrology, is, and people don't talk about this enough, astrology is actually spent, let me get this right, 1,500 years taking the spirits out of astrology to survive, right? So if you consider the Arab astrologers, you can't be dealing with spirits and demons or you get the head chop. You're just not allowed to do it. And it's sort of the same thing as what happened in the Renaissance. There's a little, and that means by the time you get to Agrippa, who's kind of okay with spirits and so on, the spirits are all contained within the rules of this system that has been denatured. And that's the same thing with Lillian moving forward. But if you go back to the idea of star spirit contact in particular will give you astrology rather than astrology describing star spirits. If you're in astrology and you haven't given much thought to spirit work, you will struggle to find it, I think. No, it's not necessarily true. It's easy to find it outside of astrology and then return and revisit how you experience astrology rather than to find it in. So I think you're right there. Like, if people want to come with you on this, it's like you have to find yourself in a universe where spirits are a thing to really flourish in this kind of framework, because it's a spirit-based framework. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we are seeing people become increasingly open to that, and that's really exciting for me. I could not be doing this work even a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I agree.
Publicly in the way I am. And that's both exciting and a little scary, right? Because it was like, where are we going? What are we tuning into? What's next? Because it feels like we're on the precipice of some really big stuff, and people's collective interest in this, I think, is going to have some kind of maximal effect. And I'm excited to be alive for that. That's like a really special thing to say, to look back on, and according to the lore of my ancestors, we all end up in the stars. We'll all end up in our respective asterism after we die. So I think that it will be really exciting to be. One of the quotes I really love is from the show Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell. And they talk about how fairy tales are actually fairies telling stories about humans. And I like to think that a lot of the ways in which we deal with this is that we are not listening to the ways in which stories are being told about us by the stars. There's a going of both ways here.
That's
and
wonderful.
Within that mutual exchange, that mutual storytelling, and that we're telling stories that the stars want us to tell about ourselves, about others, but we're creating our own legends, and we'll be our own constellations. And that is part of the reason why I feel like every person's nativity, everyone's story is so important, and that we're all adding to this exciting mythos that maybe isn't going to be as important to everyone. Not everyone's going to connect with every star, every constellation, every spirit, etc. But they're all nonetheless incredibly important, and they all are what make the sky. And that's why there isn't really that divide between the sky and the earth, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So the ancestral component of the stars themselves is something I've long obsessed over, and I gave a talk about it at a UFO conference and all kinds of stuff. But there are Aboriginal tribes who consider the stars to be the campfires of their ancestors, and having been out on country under those stars in the desert, and you're by a fire and they're right there. It is this profound sense of community, and it's a thing that is just true on every level. Because I kind of finished the talk with, like, science, materialism in particular, has like a shit boring version of that true thing, which is that classic "we are all made of star stuff." But there's something just more deeply true about saying the stars are both ancestors and the place of ancestors. That when you were giving that presentation, really opened it up. This sort of framework that you're working on is itself a microcosm of how we get astrology, because it's a system that comes from star being contact, or spirit contact, but including star being, that then facilitates further star being or spirit contact. So I was very impressed. But so with the last 10 or so minutes, because we just used fourth house as an example of absent fathers, and I think it did take a counselor to do that, right? Because I've got shamanic healing clients now, and people who's, put it this way, if you're a father and you abandon your kids when they're 4 or 5 years old, you don't just do that. There's something that happened to you that leads to it. So it's almost like if you see an absent father configuration in the natal chart, it's obvious to us, Sasha, but it's an obvious next step to say, okay, so what we're actually dealing with, however you want to describe it, is some sort of ancestral imprint and trauma to do with that. And if you let that be true, then this kind of house-based system opens up crucially to healing rather than just description, because you can't just be like, oh, your dad left when you were young, huh? And it's like, on to the next part of the reading, right? You can actually okay, cool. Well, there's stuff we can go further up the lineage and look for healing there.
Yeah, and I wouldn't do it if that weren't the case, because I think it's incredibly unethical to point out a very painful wound and then not be able to like offer something in return as a support, right? And people, I think, kind of have enough of an idea of who I am that when they come to me, they know what they're getting into. But the thing that I think is most interesting in particular with that delineation is that the clients that have that almost always are reborn from their father's side. And it is almost always, in my experience, some like direct sort of correlation around the ways in which they are then it's contingent upon them to address, understand, and I won't use the word forgive, but recognize the ways in which this is creating a cathexis, right? And I use the Freudian cathexis as in a hostile occupation in a foreign land. They're experiencing a cathexis of that within them, and that is then, because of that, though, somehow even more within their ability to change or transform.
Nice.
And we can always feel passive and victim to the things that happen to us. And I am not here to blame. Like, I would never say that you're responsible for your... But am I controversial enough to say that maybe you were always supposed to, and you were chosen to be the person that experienced that because you might be uniquely capable of addressing it, that you might be the one who is willing to listen to the fact that it's a pattern and not instead continue the pattern? Sure,
yep.
People ultimately will have their choice, but I don't think you really get fully into astrology if you aren't at least a soft determinist, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I have seen more often than not that even divorced parents that never got along were intentionally brought together because there was some medicine on either side of the family that in one way was going to make someone much more cognizant and aware of whatever patterning was going on. It was going to get them to a point where they're coming to someone like me or to someone like you with an awareness around this, and that usually if someone's with you, there is something that
like if they've made it to a session with you, Sasha, they are the person in their family who has come to Earth to do big ancestral healing work. That's just... Or else someone else from the family would be seeing it.
Would have.
No, the self-determinism is the right thing to do. And it is, I think, an expectation. There's that amongst, well, not actually the Kero, but like after what Alberto would say in the training, because the system he built was from decades of training through different Peruvian traditions. And in the north of Peru on the coast, in their kind of curanderismo, if you, the spirits of prophecy will leave you if you lie in fortune telling, right? So if you actually don't tell the truth in a session like that, and if that is the truth, if you're seeing in the chat, like I believe that, I'm not blaming you. Daddy didn't leave because he didn't love you. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you have an essential role in the healing of this instance for the universe, right? Like totally. That's and if you skirt around that, you lose your magical powers, at least according to the curanderos in the north coast of Peru, and I wouldn't fuck with them.
And I'll actually say my heliacal rising star is Alkes. So my ancestors chose that I was going to be the chalice bearer, the vessel that carries whatever message, right? Like this was chosen for me. And I noticed that whenever I choose to share it, even though first I'll Saturn, I'm convinced, right, that everyone's going to laugh at me, everyone's going to tell me I'm wrong, I'm bad, I'm stupid, whatever. There's always so many people that come forward and was like, someone said it, I needed someone to say it, I was waiting for someone to say it, etc. And that's not, that's not about tooting my own horn, but it is about saying that your stars I don't think your stars lie to you.
Yeah.
You can lie to yourself. Your brain will lie to you all the time. I don't think your stars lie to you. No. I don't think the nativity lies to you. And that is where you can go to when you are feeling caught up in this, this swell and this maelstrom, right, of what it means to live in a society and to be a figure in a culture where everyone's got something to say. The lighthouse there that we can always gravitate back toward are the fixed stars, which are not going to leave you, that are going to remind you of that fate and what you're supposed to do, and they aren't going to steer you wrong. Yeah.
So one of the things when I had the chaos magician's inherited suspicion of astrology all through my teenage years and most of my 20s, half my 20s, in fairness. But that was all Peter J. Carroll stuff. And his dismissing astrology in the early 80s was probably correct. Like the stuff that he saw at the time as a scientist was a hot mess. So I get that, but I just didn't bother updating to see. Didn't bother checking in with astrology over the last couple of decades to see that it has hot messes, but it's in a much better shape. And one of the other things, well, my way back into it was very Gnostic. Just coming back to what you're saying about the fixed stars not steering you wrong. In even half the Hermetic texts, less than half, but some of the big Hermetic texts, it's the same idea that we belong in the level of the stars or above them. So in that kind of stellar and above realm is our true home. And coming to Earth, we kind of get hit coming down through the ping pong ball of the planet, which is set to sort of govern and constrict us in a Gnostic sense. So I've always had, it took me a while to get over it, but I would have this, a kind of suspicion, a Gnostic suspicion of the planets, but more importantly, a profound understanding, just coming back to what you're saying, the stars will not steer you wrong. The stars will not lie to you. There is a purity to stellar energy that is less earthy, like it's literally more alien than you get with planets. That's the bit that I've come around to. It's like, actually, it's not just because they're governing doesn't make them necessarily bad, right? So I eventually, I caught up, but it was more that they're more terrestrially involved in the physical in a way that the fixed stars aren't, and you can kind of have like a resonance.
They have more myopic agendas that are also more like ours.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. So do you have, because we should have some actual ghost stories towards the end, are there really cool, obviously anonymized, but like, are there really cool instances of this sort of haunted house system that you found that stuck with you? Like, oh, I had one client who had this, or I have this, and it turned out it was that. Do you have any of them? I should have asked you this before we hit record rather than putting you on the spot. But are there a couple of them that come to mind? Like, I had one person, because when I reached out, I mentioned the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the 12th before, because when you were talking about the 12th house in the presentation, I'm like, that there's the Goetia, there's this, and I was like, wow, I should talk to Sasha because she just described my 12th house and consequently my life. But were there any, have you had any like, oh, this is a cool one?
Yeah, I'm trying to, so I'm going to keep out the delineation, so that keeps it more anonymized. Sure. But they're always the ones where I think I'm like really about to embarrass myself. Like I'm really about I was doing a reading for my friend, one of my good friends who lives here, and this was really kind of at the beginning of when I was leaning into the more spirit site based way of doing this. And I was like, hey, this sounds crazy, but I'm seeing, and I described the spirit behind her, and it turned out that this had been a spirit that she had been seeing since her childhood, right? And since she was a little girl and had this really intense relationship with, and blah, 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 and it separated with in adulthood due to certain circumstances. And that led to the reconciliation with that spirit, which was that was one of my first, like, there's something to this, right? And for me, this delineation is Venus in the 9th house. Venus in the 9th house, by and large, is, regardless I have found of sign, of dignity, any of these things have not factored into it. But Venus in the 9th house for me is almost always led to an inherited familiar or consort spirit.
Oh.
And sometimes one that has traveled literally from across continents, countries, seas, etc., through the lineage and the sort of either as a family daemon or as a spirit that has essentially been is trying to propose to or be engaged with someone. So that was one of the ones, and that one has proven itself kind of over and over again in really weird ways for me, and I've looked deeper into trying to figure out more continuating circumstances that would substantiate why it is, because it is sort of general. And obviously that isn't everyone with a spirit, but it's over and over again. That's been the one.
Well, you can add me. You can add me to that list.
Oh, really?
I have Venus in the 9th, and I have I have a familiar, a family inherited familiar.
Oh, well, there we go. Yeah. Look, hey, that wasn't scripted.
No, that's why when I was watching your presentation, I'm like, I don't show my chart. Is this bitch using my chart?
Yeah, I get a lot of sorcerers who are like, wait a minute.
Yeah. No, that's really...
Which temptress harpy you have scryed into my blah, blah, blah. I was like, Sophie, I don't care, dude, you know?
Very cool.
Yeah, that's a example of that happening. And for some reason, especially, it's not that other like there aren't different ways to find that elsewhere for other occupations in the chart. But that one in particular, I always see them.
So
when I'm in
let's speculate.
I literally always see them.
Let's speculate then. Like, because Venus is, of course, the morning star. So there are, and Lucifer, or the devil at the top of a hierarchy, gives familiars. And it's obviously like House of God and so on. So it's like, maybe it's something in that direction. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, so I've tried to think a lot about this as another person with Venus in the ninth house. And that's how I first had this realization, right? I think we are often our own first cases of study. And we're more likely to notice patterns if it's something we can identify with ourselves. And I think at the end of the day, I'm not sure if it is about Venus being in the ninth house that makes that relationship there, that someone inherits that or is destined to have it, or if it is simply because it is in the ninth house more visible to me.
Yeah, okay.
Than it would be somewhere else. So I bounced back and forth with the fact that it might be my own synastry with the ninth house. It might be because the person is able to identify it more easily because that spirit shows up to them in visions or dreams or scrying sessions, or because they are more magically oriented, or because they've taken those travels to foreign lands where they may have encountered the spirit. There's like a lot of things where I'm like, is it the house or is it Venus there? Like, or is it this mutual combination that is so necessary to it? But I will say that Venus in Vedic astrology is the lord of demons.
Exactly.
And for me, that's a really important part about when we look at Venus. I do not see Venus. I see Venus, yes, as having rulership over of relationships, sure, in certain ways. I mean, so does the moon. But importantly, I think that Venus is where we find many daemons. And we find daemons that crave love or sex or attention or closeness or enmeshment, or more importantly, to be able to come through the viscera, the body of a lover or of as a fetch, doesn't matter what term we want to use or how, to do their work on this earth with other people. Yeah. That they have a vested interest in contributing to, participating, and sort of skinwalking as that person in a certain way as well.
The Vedic thing is important. For me, whenever Venus doesn't make sense, I swap out Lucifer, like morning star Lucifer, and I'm not saying that's the universal solve, but I'm saying very often if Venus doesn't make sense to me, I'm like, maybe you're Lucifer. And then I look at it and go,
totally.
There's an insight there. That's really cool.
Yeah. But the funny thing about the benefics, not always having benefic things within their auspices too, right?
Well, exactly. And this is
big for necromancy.
Yeah, but it comes back to that sequencing of these beings predating, obviously, the system of astrology, right? So the system of astrology is a relational game that's designed to capture and understand certain aspects of these beings, because it can only capture certain aspects, but the beings are bigger. And the trick is to find the true size of astrology, so that it doesn't the universe doesn't work because of astrology, but astrology works because of how the universe is structured.
Absolutely.
That kind of, that's really cool.
And quite frankly, which Venus doesn't have, like, in any culture that you go to, whatever their Venus is, right, almost always has inbuilt a chthonic journey.
Absolutely.
Always has to come down, always has to cavort in traffic in tranquil spirits or dirty spirits in some capacity. Like there's a real connection there that you don't necessarily see with the lore of other gods or planets, or gods assigned to planets or planets assigned to gods. But Venus always has that connection to the underworld.
Definitely. I had a series of really good rituals around whatever year that was, 2018. Venus retrograde in Scorpio.
Oh, in Scorpio
was so good. Like the Inanna Ereshkigal stuff.
Yeah,
really good at that. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
not,
huge force of whaling.
yeah. All right, so we've spoken about haunted houses and curses and blessings from outer space. What you live in New Orleans, which again, referring to Principal Skinner, not much of a party town, but like, what have you got? What's going on either for you or around you for Halloween?
I don't know yet. I mean, I'm probably gonna go into the woods
Good call.
with my partner and do some weird stuff. You know, it's a it's a waning crescent in I think Alawach Lunar Mansion. So it's good for a lot of weird things that are kept secret in the dark, covered in wine.
Very cool. Yeah. That would ordinarily be me, but I'm doing something extremely heterosexual, and we're going to see Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's touring in the state capital. So Halloween night, I'm going to be seeing Rocky Horror.
I mean, that's kind of that sounds like a you Halloween, right? Like, what's the weird, divergent, not typical thing that you're going to be doing?
Yeah.
How are you celebrating the other?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
doing a thing you normally wouldn't be doing.
yeah. Well, so one of the things I love about living down here is that when you lived in a town, you want that doth the goth thing. You actually always want to fuck off into the woods. And when you're in the woods, you're like, well, this is surprisingly convenient, actually. But then, yeah, so I'm reversing it. And instead of fleeing into the woods for Halloween, I'm going to go and watch Rocky Horror, which it's appropriate. It's its own kind of, it's its own kind of appropriate.
It's festive. It's a different type of festive.
Exactly. Well, all right. This has been super cool, and I'm glad. And thank you very much for humoring me for like the Halloween special theme of the show.
Oh yeah, no, it was my pleasure.
All right. So, Sasha, for people who want to know more, like, what do you got coming up? Where can they find you? That kind of thing. Lay it on us.
Whew. Yeah, I'm taking a sabbatical from classes and everything while I work on the book and meet deadlines for my very, very patient and compassionate editor, but in publisher at this time. Thank you very much, Jen. But I have the recording from the Astromagia talk. If people are interested in it, they're welcome to email me, and I can hook them up with that. As far as consultations, I'm booked out through the end of the year, but have availability still going on in January. For the most part, Patreon is where you want to get me. I'm about to start a really cool project with my patrons on Discord around exploring Georges Bataille's Eroticism, Death, and Sensuality as a magical text, and a way of doing some cool remediation on the Taurus-Scorpio axis of these eclipses coming up, and looking at the Thanatos and libidinal drives. So if you want to do some weird stuff and you're interested in the intersection of philosophy, psychoanalysis, astrology, occult, magic, etc., Patreon's going to be the best place to find me.
Awesome. And so the links for people listening and driving, you get all of that at your website?
Yeah. So SashaRavitch.com is my website. I tried to make this really easy. Sasha.Ravitch is my Instagram, and there's my Linktree on that, so you can get everything. And then Patreon.com/Sasha Ravitch is my Patreon. If you Google those things too, they'll hopefully come up. There aren't a whole lot of Sasha Ravitch.
Awesome. And
that's the main place.
And if you are like driving and listening, of course, this is all in the show notes anyway. So yeah, well, this has been super interesting and super fun. Really good Halloween special. So Sasha, thank you very, very much, and happy Halloween.
It was a huge pleasure. Thank you so much, Gordon. You have a great holiday.